Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center, and welcome to September. We're less than 2 months away to Election Day, and less than 5 months away until Inauguration Day. It's a time when we're all taking stock of the American presidency. We're evaluating the two candidates' promises and our own expectations about what this next president will do. But should we be, or rather, what should we be doing in an era of seemingly ever expanding presidential powers? The exact boundaries of the president's authorities seem to be constantly in question. The executive office has slowly expanded over the past several decades. In fact, over the whole 200 plus century, 200 years, 2 centuries of our Constitution, enabled by other branches and perhaps even by us, the people. So the discussion of this expansion has been a source of great debate and opinion. And to cut through that, we have a real expert with us today. We're delighted to have Saikrishna Prakash, a faculty senior fellow here at the Miller Center and a professor at the School of Law here at the University of Virginia. Sai's new book, The Living Presidency, an originalist argument against its ever-expanding powers, is a terrific read. It is certainly a book of legal scholarship, but it's something that every citizen can and should read, understand, and wrestle with. So we're delighted to have Sai with us today. He's been with us several times before. We've really enjoyed and learned from his presence on panels on one topic or another over the last few years. And we're delighted to get to discuss a great new book of his. So Sai, welcome.
Bill, I am delighted, utterly delighted to be with you and all the viewers out there. This is just a great treat for me. So thank you for making this possible.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Let's get right into it. So what were they thinking? That is the founders. You are an originalist. You make an originalist argument. So we have to go back to the origins. Your last book was called Imperial from the Beginning, about the presidency. What does that mean? How did we, to understand how we got here, let's go back to where we started.
So the first book was a book that tried to describe the original presidency and all its facets. And one of the big takeaways is the original presidency really wasn't designed to be weak. They had experiences with weak executives at the states and at the federal level. And they decided we needed a stronger executive to, both defend the nation, but also to execute federal laws. And they didn't have a strong executive. So they created a strong executive, gave it a veto, which most state governors didn't have, gave it a pardon authority which most state governors didn't have. And the end result is something sort of that resembled a monarchy. And that's why I called it imperial from the beginning. And you have, the sage of Monticello saying this, but John Adams and a bunch of different people saying, this kind of looks like an elective monarchy. So that was the first book, but it wasn't all powerful, Bill. It wasn't meant to be all powerful, right? It had a check on legislation, not legislative authority directly. It could not make treaties without the Senate's consent. It could not wage war because the power to declare war was vested with Congress. And it couldn't change our Constitution because the Constitution had this very elaborate process for changing it. And the president actually has no formal role in that. He can make proposals, but he doesn't vote or veto on amendments.
See, yeah, let's get into this a little bit. You talk about, and one of the things that's so rich in the book is you spend some time talking about the oath of office as actually written into the Constitution. An oath that we're probably all a little bit familiar with. It begins with, I swear to faithfully execute and uphold the Constitution, including implied in that is interpreting the Constitution. Talk to us a little bit about that, what you thought the founders meant for the president as a constitutional officer.
Sure. So every federal and state officer and every federal and state legislature has to take an oath to support the Constitution. And by statute, Congress has provided the oath that state and federal officers have to take. But the Constitution itself, as you note, requires a particular oath of the president. And the president has to take an oath to faithfully execute the office, but also to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so I think they thought that this office was so important that an express oath in the Constitution had to be applied to it. And so, of course, every president begins his term, his or her term, with this particular oath. What do they mean by it? I think, preserve, protect, and defend means two different things. One, that presidents themselves won't violate the Constitution, right? Firefighters don't start fires. Presidents who take an oath to defend it defend the Constitution from the attacks of others, be they foreigners who want to overthrow our government, but also Congress or other people who might want to overthrow the Constitution, like rebels, right? Congress might exceed its authorities. Rebels would obviously be trying to overthrow the Constitution. So in the face of those threats, he's got to preserve, protect, and defend. And of course, we've seen presidents invoke that in the context of vetoes, but also rebellions, right? Abraham Lincoln references the oath, saying, I took an oath to defend it and you took no oath to undermine it. And so I'm going to stand up and, fight for our Constitution. He was speaking to the Southern rebels, right? So it's played a role in our history, sort of, stiffening the spine of presidents against those who might try to violate the Constitution, at least as the president sees it. And that's the important point, as you point out. What the Constitution is often deeply contested. And the president, there's nothing in the Constitution saying that the president has to follow the views of others. At least in the first instance, the president has to decide for himself what the Constitution means. We often forget that the Supreme Court was a bit player in constitutional interpretation for the first 2 decades. Most constitutional interpretation occurred in Congress and in the presidency, full stop. The courts were not big players in that.
Yeah, I'm reminded early in the book, as you unpack this again, that Jefferson, in the second year of his presidency, when he's negotiating the Louisiana Purchase, is debating in his own cabinet and with a few outsiders whether he had the authority to buy land. He certainly had a treaty authority, but he didn't have an explicit authority to actually purchase land from another government. And Madison ends up saying, just do it.
Well, yeah, the book doesn't discuss that at great length, but my sense of the matter is the whole cabinet thought it was constitutional to use the treaty power to acquire land. Jefferson was a strict constructionist, and he did not think that the Constitution authorized the government to acquire land. But I think Jefferson was wrong. His cabinet thought he was wrong, and we've had many treaties with Indian tribes that are just about, in part, acquiring land. So it's often cited as a president acting against the Constitution, what Jefferson did. But I think in this case, Jefferson was wrong about the Constitution. Not the first time or the last time that a president has been wrong about the Constitution.
Right. So if that bounds the president's foreign policy powers on one side, the other side that often gets discussed contemporaneously is the president has nearly unlimited powers on foreign policy. Is that right? In the original,
I think that more accurately describes what we have today. So if you go back to the founding, right, the president is given very few express authorities. He's given authority to appoint ambassadors with the Senate's consent. He's given authority to make treaties. And then the Congress, has authority over foreign commerce and can create, crimes where international law is violated and can declare war. So there's a lot of foreign affairs authorities that aren't expressly mentioned. And I've argued elsewhere that it's actually granted to the president under the vesting clause. But there are a couple of things one needs to remember. The president doesn't have the keys to the Treasury, Congress does. And so if they don't want to fund his foreign policy, they don't have to. And they don't have to send all these ambassadors everywhere, right? The Senate can just say, no, we don't need to have all these ambassadors. And that can severely impinge upon the president's conduct of foreign affairs. In the early days, we didn't have ambassadors or ministers plenipotentiary with most foreign nations, in part because we just didn't think it was useful. It was very expensive to maintain a foreign representative back then, and we were a very, relatively poor country. We didn't see the advantage of having ambassadors to every country. So I think the idea that the president's, quote, in charge of foreign affairs is really a reflection of a modern mindset. There was some sense that the president had pretty broad authority in foreign affairs, but not to the extent that we have today.
So that's maybe a good transition to from where we started to how we got here today. But maybe I want to start that question of how we got here with why we got here today. Why did we get to a living presidency? And maybe the first way of getting this is it our own expectations. Why did William, one great thing you quote in the book, which I'd never seen before, is William Henry Harrison saying he wanted to avoid the corrupting system of requiring pledges. Unpack that for us a little bit. What is he talking about there?
So, presidents or people who were, quote, running for president, people really didn't say they were running for president, but people who kind of wanted the office were being judged in the early days by their resumes, what they had done for the country. Think of Washington, think of Adams, think of Jefferson, think of Madison. They're all running on their resumes. They're not running on a bunch of promises. But over time, it's understood that they are kind of running, right? And people start asking them to make pledges. And I think Harrison, is saying the old system involved no one making pledges, and I prefer the old system. I think he thinks it's corrupting in the sense that if you make a pledge, you feel pressure to follow through, even where you might not have authority to do so, which I discuss at great length, or even when you come to a different conclusion about what is the right policy. That is to say, if you just say you're going to give someone a tax cut or something else, some sort of goodie, you might actually believe in the moment, when you're actually president, that that's not a good idea anymore, but you still might feel compelled to follow it. And so it's corrupting in that sense, right? Because you're pledging to do something that might take you away from your best judgment in the moment. But the more general point I was citing him for was, this was a different concept of what the presidency was about, right? The presidency was a law executor first and foremost. He was the sort of chief law enforcement officer, not the attorney general. And by the time of Harrison, it became clear that presidents were running on a policy platform of the sort that we would find recognizable today, right? 2 chickens in every pot and a car in every garage, and a tax cut and guns, or whatever your favorite promise is. Presidents run on promises today, and it would be absurd for a candidate to say, I'm not going to make any promises because I'm just going to do what I think is best, and it's not my job to change your laws. It's Congress's job, and I'll play a role to veto or not, but I'm not going to be the driver. People think of the president as being the chief legislator in a way that wasn't true a long time ago. And so, the funny thing about his promise, Harrison's promise, is he said, I'm not going to make promises, and simultaneously made one. I'm only going to run one term, right? Which is an odd juxtaposition, especially today, because we would never think it was a good idea for presidents to say, I'm only going to run one term, because it makes them a lame duck from the first day.
Yeah, evidently, Vice President Biden had contemplated saying that, but they backed off, contemplated saying it because of his age and other things. And the whole premise, one big premise of his campaign is replacing Donald Trump. And there was some thought that he might come out with a pledge that he was going to only serve one term, but evidently that's been killed because it disempowers him right from the beginning if he says that. Mm-hmm. So just to elaborate on that point a bit, and I'll combine 2 things here. You also write, policy innovation, not superior implementation, is the coin of the realm for candidates and presidents. And let me just connect that to something else you said, which is, if Congress is not going to legislate, has it gotten worse because Congress is not seen as the prime mover of legislation?
I think that's certainly the case. I think Congress is not the prime mover in 2 different senses. One, over decades, it's delegated authority to the executive branch, right? Well, we call them rules or regulations, but they're just laws by other names. And so a lot of the rules and law, things that people worry about or have to comply with come from these agencies and not Congress. And then 2, it's become more difficult for Congress to pass legislation in the past several decades, in the sense that legislators see that passing legislation is a sign of compromise, which doesn't play well with the base. The base wants maximalist policies, and passing legislation is basically giving in to the other side. And so legislatures just choose not to pass legislation, right? They'll pass a budget bill every year because that has to be passed, but everything else never gets passed, right? And so you heard people complain about this during the Obama administration, and Obama came out with the pen and phone strategy and the "We can't wait" slogan. And now, this president has said the same sort of thing, right? That he can't get things through Congress, and so he's just going to do stuff administratively, right? He said he was going to dismantle Obamacare administratively. It's an extraordinary thing to say, but it's really kind of par for the course. When the president can't get stuff through Congress, they just try to bypass it by hook or by crook.
Just for the audience, 2 points here. One is one of our other Miller Center scholars who is a friend and collaborator of Sai's at a number of our events and other activities, I think is the one who introduced Sai to us. Sid Milk has written on this point as well. He calls it executive-centered partisanship, which is if Congress can't move the partisan interests of one party or another, all the expectations fall on the president. So the second is to talk to you, the people, that is you in the audience, start pulling your questions together. Please send them to us in the Q&A function. I'm going to ask Sai a few more questions and then come back and start answering yours. So Sai, going to that, to we the people, you tell this great story, I think toward the end of the book, the Banana Boy story. Tell us the Banana Boy story and why we the people are partly responsible for this.
So the Banana Boy story is a story my dad told me, and I don't know where he got it from. I should ask him. The Banana Boy story is a story about a boy in India who brings home a banana every day to a family that's impoverished. And the grandmother eagerly eats the banana and is very happy about it, but never asks, well, how did this boy come to get these bananas? What's going on here? And it turns out that one day, the police come and tell the family the boy's been stealing bananas. And the Banana Boy, my recollection now, and I haven't read the last chapter again, but the Banana Boy slaps his grandmother and says, you should have told me that this was wrong. And I basically analogize the American people to the boy. I think what's going on is that half the population is willing to stomach whatever presidents do in service of their partisan agenda, right? If you want a wall, you're willing to let the president do pretty much whatever he can do to get you a wall. If you want, a workable, Affordable Care Act, you're going to be willing to let the president do whatever he can do administratively or otherwise to make it a workable act. And so both parties are primed to look the other way when the president fulfills the party's agenda. And of course, to pounce on the president when the president is of an opposite party doing those very same things. And I think the problem is if half the country is cheering on the president's, what I perceive to be a president's lawless actions, they're like the grandmother who's just looking the other way and eating the banana. Now, the grandmother is a more sympathetic person because I think she's, in the story, she's kind of starving. We're not really starving, right? If we don't have like I know people really care about walls and healthcare, but we're a relatively wealthy country. And if we don't get what we want, it's not the end of the world. And so we're sort of more culpable. If we are unwilling to stand up to a president or a series of presidents who are, basically twisting the law to achieve policy ends, many of which might be noble in some greater sense, then we are basically turning a blind eye to executive aggrandizement. That's the Banana Boy story. Part of me just wanted to include it because it was my dad's way of teaching me certain morals, don't steal, but it seemed apt. And I thought, why not include it as a sort of a tribute to my father?
I do love the emergency piece of it, though, Sai, that you just brought in now, because just in thinking about it and actually in looking back at previous economic crises and previous political crises that presidents have engaged in election years and then in transitions, I am struck that some of these things did evolve out of the New Deal and the post-World War II era, where we were in emergency situations and we were willing to delegate because it did feel like an emergency and we almost had no choice. But when we revert back to regular governing, we don't claim those powers back. There does feel to me to be a bit of, in an emergency, sure, but if everything's an emergency, then nothing's an emergency, is kind of a main point that comes out in the book.
I think there's a lot of truth to that emergencies tend to grow executive power, just like wars tend to grow executive power. There are some counterexamples. Lincoln did a bunch of things during the Civil War There was a reversion to the status quo ante after Lincoln. So Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, but during the Grant administration, Congress authorized the suspension by law. So there are counterexamples where emergencies, president seize authority and then they give it back. I think, the reason why we have a huge administrative state that acts as a second Congress, I think, is in part because some people believed in sort of the progressive ideal of nonpartisan expert government. And so it wasn't just the New Deal that caused a rise in delegation. It preceded the New Deal in part. And so that's sort of why it would also continue as well. And then the second part of the emergency stuff is that Congress has passed all these statutes that give the president authority that turns on emergencies. And what's happened over the past 50 or so years is the presidents say there's an emergency when what they really mean is it's just useful to take this measure. And then presidents cite each other for the proposition that if they say there's an emergency, that's the end of the matter. And Congress, the only way Congress can overturn it is by statute. So we have a bunch of faux emergencies that no sensible person thinks is an emergency that's grounded on this idea that presidents have denuded the word emergency of any sort of meaning. And that's bipartisan. It's not, the most recent instance is Trump on the wall because that's the most sort of salient and the most controversial. But the presidents do this with less controversial things as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna drill down on one in a way that I haven't given you a heads up on, but it's one that I pay some attention to and think about a lot. And that's a big debate that went to the Supreme Court over whether EPA could use its executive authority to regulate for climate change. And a conservative Supreme Court said, actually, in the Clean Air Act that was passed and signed by the first President Bush, there was an authority to regulate for a series of pollutants that are listed in the law and any other air pollution that is dangerous to humans. And a conservative court in the early 2000s, when sued by Massachusetts to make EPA regulate for these things, said, yeah, actually, EPA has the authority under that regulation. Now, that is a law that was given to the executive, but was given quite expansively. The executive in the Bush administration chose not to use it. And what the Supreme Court seemed to be saying was, you could use it. And then in the Obama administration, Obama, going back to your pen and phone strategy, says to Congress, please legislate, but if you don't, I'm going to execute. So help us unpack that a little bit. In the current presidency, where we have something, climate change, where some people think is an emergency, including the governor of California, who is facing quite literally a burning emergency and is blaming it on climate change. Should the president view this as an emergency power? It's years in the making and it's years in the offing. Or should he simply say, nope, sorry, you got to legislate. I can't do this by myself. You, Congress, must legislate.
That is a great and difficult question. I don't think that either the Bush or the Obama administration or the Supreme Court said that the Clean Air Act gave the president emergency authority. I think the Supreme Court said the act is expansive enough to cover climate change to cover things like climate change. And so you can't just say you don't have authority over, the emission of carbon dioxide in particular. And so it was a reading, as you said, of an expansive statute, but not one that turned on the presence or absence of an emergency.
Right.
And so, another way of putting it is, even if someone were to say there is no emergency, but I think we ought to do something about climate change, the court said, yeah, you've got the authority under the Clean Air Act. Now, it's a difficult question whether that's the proper reading of the Clean Air Act, and I'm not an expert on the Clean Air Act. I've got friends at the law school who are, and I would defer to them. But I can give you a parallel case that came out differently, and that was whether the FDA had authority to regulate nicotine in tobacco. And the Clinton administration said yes, and the Supreme Court said no. And what they sort of said is, this question about nicotine has been before Congress for decades, and they've never passed legislation on it specifically. And they sort of concluded that suggested that Congress didn't suppose that the FDA Act covered nicotine. So it's possible that the Supreme Court's conclusion about climate, about CO2 emissions was wrong based on this sort of, FDA understanding of the statute. But it's a very complicated question that turns on a statute, as it should, but it also turns on this idea that Congress can delegate broad authority to the president. Do we think that is constitutional? Do we think it's a good idea? Because part of the problem with that is
go find me a banana, Mr. President. I don't care where you get it and how you get it.
Part of what happens is one president does something and the next president undoes it, right? So I'm going to write elsewhere that the president, Obama had a pen and phone strategy and the president still has that, but he also has the eraser. He's erasing everything the president does. And that's what, Obama did to Bush. And so we have fairly wide swings in policy, in part because the laws aren't as stable or as detailed as they could be, giving the president lots of discretion and meaning that there's large swings in policies from administration to administration.
All right, so the questions are starting to roll in. So I'm going to ask you one more and then we'll turn to audience questions. And it's one that we did talk about a little bit in advance, which is you get an hour with candidate Biden or candidate Trump, President-elect Biden or re-elected Trump during the transition. They're moving toward their oath of office. The promises have already been made. We're well past the promising stage at this point, I think. What do you tell them? How does the incoming president rethink the presidency based on this book?
First of all, I tell them you're with the wrong person. You need to you need to have a better screener. You need to have someone who really values your time. I think, look, I understand that a proper conception of the office is not the only thing that presidents think about, right? I think the way I describe it in the book, the president wants to do things. He then goes to the lawyers and says, find me a way to do it. And sometimes they find him a way and sometimes they don't. But more often than you or I would, they find a way for him to do it, right? Because they sort of see themselves as the president's lawyers. And so I guess what I would suggest is, you've got to think about the presidency and the Constitution in the long term. It's unhealthy for the Constitution to have an 800-pound gorilla called the presidency and a very weak Congress and a somewhat strong judiciary. That's not healthy for our democracy in the long run. And the way for you to restore that is to have a more circumscribed understanding of your office, one that doesn't involve maximalist readings of statutory and constitutional authority. And, I think you can trade this conception, right? You can be willing to accept statutes that diminish your authority in return for parts of your agenda, right? I think this is clear. Most presidents don't care about the presidency per se. They care about what they can do. If you go to this president and say, here's $2 billion for your wall, accept all these restrictions on your authority, he's going to accept them because he, in the long run, doesn't care about the next occupant in the White House. They are expanding presidential power to get their agenda through. They are not thinking about what it means for the country. But that also means that they are I think they'd be willing to make a deal on the presidency if they got parts of their agenda. And it's invariably the case that they will get parts of their agenda, right? I think the president got part of his wall, oddly enough, once the Democrats took over the House. He could not get it through the Republican House or Senate, but somehow got the House to agree to it. They're always going to get part of their agenda through Congress. And I don't see why Congress just doesn't say, you've got to take the bitter with the sweet. But again, if the first thing I would tell President Biden or President Trump is you need to have a better screen.
I do want to actually, before going to the questions, since I said we'd turn to the questions around 11:30, we've got 1 minute left. I'll ask you one. You have a great number of recommendations for how to right size the presidency. There he's back. You've got a great number of recommendations for how to right size the presidency toward the end of the book. Let me focus on a couple and have you pick one to talk about. You suggest that we should confirm White House officials. As a former White House official, I'm glad this comes after my time there, that we could sunset emergency provisions, that, as we've already discussed, some laws are written for executive discretion. That we could have an oversight authority on impeachment that is different than the way we do it now, or that we should look for more independent agencies. There are a number of agencies that don't report to the president that sit in this netherland between one, for instance, that President Carter evidently thought about was having the Justice Department as an independent agency, but then he got in and his White House lawyers told him, don't do that. If there's one that you would focus on, which do you think could have great effect and great positive effect?
That's a great question. I'm loath to single out one, and they gave like 13 constitutional ones, and then 3 of them that I thought were unconstitutional. But if the president could act beyond the scope of his office, I thought Congress should be able to as well. I think just to focus on the first one you mentioned, I think it's astonishing that the White House counsel was not a advice and consent position, that the White House chief of staff is not an advice and consent position. Those positions are in many ways, certainly the White House chief of staff is more powerful than many cabinet secretaries, right? He or she controls the flow of information, controls who gets to see the president in most administrations, maybe not this one. And, often speaks for the president to the bureaucracy. And so, there were times, I think, in, the prior 2 administrations, I don't know about this one, where someone in the White House would just call a department and tell them what to do. And that someone would often be the White House chief of staff. And they would speak on behalf of the president, but it was never, it's not necessarily clear that that's the case. So I think it's important that these people be, subject to advice and consent more than the hundreds of people in the departments who don't have a lot of power, right? The assistant secretary for procurement isn't as important as the White House chief of staff. So I'm not saying everybody in the White House is to be confirmed by the Senate. The point is you give leverage to the senators to ensure that someone is appropriate for the job, and you get the chance to extract promises from the person. And not everybody keeps their promises, but I do think that making a public promise makes it more difficult for people to violate it. It's not impossible, but I think it makes it slightly more difficult. But the book has tons of suggestions, and so that's why you need to buy it, right? We'll keep the mystery.
I highly recommend that, and not just because it benefits Sai. I think anybody that reads it really will come away with a much better understanding of how the office and why the office was structured as it was, what it's evolved to, and how we should think about it as the people that get to eat the bananas. Whether or not they're green bananas, good bananas, or brown bananas, they are the ones that we have to eat. So let's go to some questions. I'm going to start with David Priest, who has served in government. Great presentation so far. Thanks. A question. Which presidents historically have been most willing to publicly take responsibility for the consequences of inflammatory rhetoric? And are there lessons of those experiences for us today?
That's a nice question, Mr. Priest. I haven't studied presidential rhetoric. I think this president's rhetoric is singular. And so I don't know if other presidents used inflammatory public rhetoric and then accepted responsibility for it. If other presidents were more measured, there was no occasion for them to take responsibility for it. So I don't know how to answer that question. I think this president is singular in many different ways. He's certainly singular in terms of his, rhetoric and, in many other ways too. So I'll just leave it at that.
Lauren Hershey asks something that we've paid a lot of attention to here at the Miller Center. Please comment on the War Powers Act, and you do comment on it in the book. Its intended utility, its strengths, its weaknesses, and how it might be improved, if at all, by amendment. And he thanks you for your scholarship and commentary.
That's so kind of Lauren. So the War Powers Act was passed in 1973, and it was a response to this notion that presidents could start wars on their own say-so. And that it has a provision saying, we think you can only use the military if there's a declaration of war and authorization to use military force, or if the armed forces of the United States or territories have been attacked. And then it has a secondary provision which says unless the Congress has authorized the use of military force, you need to withdraw US forces from hostilities within 90 days. And the idea was to say, if American forces are attacked overseas, you've got 90 days to fight, but after 90 days, you need to withdraw. And what's happened is the administrations over time have A, claimed an authority to wage war without congressional authorization, B, read the War Powers Act as if it were sort of a 90-day get out of free jail card, that you can use force for 90 days, that the act actually acknowledges that the president has constitutional authority to use force for 90 days. And so instead of the act being read to constrain presidential war making, administration cited as if it sort of implicitly acknowledged 90 days of presidential war making. And so a lot of people judge the act to be a failure. In the book, I say, look, it's really hard to answer that question, whether it's been a failure or a partial success. Why might it be a partial success? You have to ask the counterfactual. Would we have had longer and many more wars in the absence of the War Powers Act? That is to say, does the War Powers Act, reduce the number of presidential wars from 10 to 5 and reduce their duration from 120 days to 90 days? If it's done that, it's done something. Now, has it been a complete success? No, obviously not. And it's in part because there's sort of no teeth to the War Powers Act. It lays out principles, but nothing is upon impeachment, and impeachment is just a scarecrow. It's impossible to impeach a president in the modern era because of partisan affiliations. So in the book, I describe, well, you could add teeth to the War Powers Act. One thing you could do is just say, there's going to be an automatic cut to some part of the budget that the president favors if he engages in a presidential war. Because I think everyone acknowledges that Congress has the power of the fisc. It passes appropriations. It doesn't have to fund new weapon systems or the executive office of the president. And so if the president knew, or the military knew that every time they started a war, there'd be some cut in some program that they favor, I think that would tend to more greatly impinge their willingness to start those wars. At least that's the suggestion. You need to add teeth to the provision. And then of course you need to be willing to enforce the teeth, right? Because if the end result is you say there's going to be a cut in the Defense Department budget, but the president spends the money anyway, then you've got the problem of, the perennial problem of pieces of paper, right? I mean, any piece of paper isn't worth the ink or the paper it's written on if there are no consequences to violating what's on the piece of paper, right? And ultimately laws are just pieces of paper. If we don't take them seriously and attach consequences to their violation, they're not going to mean anything, right? They're like the resolution that you write on New Year's, right? I'm going to lose weight. You pin it to your fridge. It's only going to have, consequences if you are true to it. If you aren't, then it's just something you wrote down.
That one cuts a little close to home, Si. You did mention in that last answer, you touched on impeachment as not actually being that relevant to power anymore because of the partisan nature of Congress. There are two questions, I guess, that I'd cluster around that have come in. One is your thoughts on the relationship between the president and the Department of Justice, both in general and specific to the current administration. And then the second is your thoughts about the rule of law in America today, especially in view of presidential behavior. I think what some of these people may be asking is, if we have too many to be lawless, and the Department of Justice seems to be tying both hands behind its back to say that we can't indict a sitting president, this has to rest with Congress. And then you marry that to what you've just said, that impeachment has become somewhat toothless because it's become so polarized. Where does that leave us on the rule of law and presidential behavior? And we can set that outside of the current Trump presidency situation. But so, in fact, why don't you try that first, and then we'll come back to you about the current situation, since you were in our panel on impeachment last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think this book is not about the Trump administration, and it's a deep mistake to think that the Trump administration is really doing something different than other administrations. Right? President Obama took us to war in Libya. President Trump hasn't taken us to a full-fledged war, even though he's attacked two sovereign nations, right? Libya and Iran. President Trump has played fast and loose with statutes, but so did President Obama and so did President Bush, right? I discussed the auto bailout, which was not authorized by statute. I discussed the insurance company bailout, which was not appropriated by Congress. There's a bunch of examples. So I don't want to get into a game of which president is worse, because I think that's just not worth my time. And maybe you could just decide that one president was epsilon worse, but the more general issue is what the presidency is becoming. And so the book does not really discuss Trump, right? I know that's what's most on people's minds because he's the president. But look, my prediction is, unless President Biden has actually meets with me and decides to change course, he's going to be doing much of the same things that President Trump is doing, because he's going to have lawyers that are going to be giving him much of the same advice. It's not as if, the OLC or the White House counsel is more virtuous or has a more constrained conception of the presidency during Democratic or Republican administrations. They both want to help advance the president's agenda. And if they can get it through Congress, great. But if it can't, they're going to, adopt strained legal interpretations to do what they want. So that's my sort of first answer to this, because I can sense that, there's a lot of hostility to the president. I certainly understand that. I've got, I won't tell you what my personal view, but I've got family members who dislike the president and family members who like the president. I've got America in my family. So I can, I hear it all and I take it in and, but the book isn't about him. I'm happy to talk about, him. And I think that's your second question, right, Bill? What's your second question?
Yeah, I guess the question goes to, that was actually my second question, was in the particular about him. But the bigger question is using the Trump experience as a case study. Mm-hmm. If the Department of Justice across administration says, and it said it in the Clinton administration, that it would not pursue legal action against the president,
right,
that's rightfully the role of Congress.
Right.
And yet if Congress can't constrain a president legally because of polarization, just in the same way that Congress has a hard time legislating.
Right.
How does the rule of law relate to the president?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that all administrations say the president can't be indicted and can't be prosecuted, certainly can't be punished criminally. That is a presidential view across administrations, Democratic or Republican, which leaves impeachment, as you just said. And as you just said, and I just said, that's not viable either. So the only way is to use other mechanisms, right, to get to the point. Now, are there certain things that the president could do that everyone would regard as, something worthy of impeachment? Yeah, it's just hard to fathom what they would be, right? I think if a president was dumb enough to skirt the law with respect to an area that wasn't a core part of his party's platform, then neither his party nor the other party would come to his defense. And so if you look at the wall, there were a lot of Republicans who were opposed to it. A, because they can see how that when the shoe's on the other foot, it will pinch them. But B, they don't favor a wall, right? They favor a wall with $1 billion, not with the extra money that he reallocated. So whenever presidents do something that's outside of the party platform, that just, is going to do what they want to do, then they're going to face pushback. And there was even some pushback, although it was minimal, to Trump trying to get Ukraine to investigate Biden, right? There were some Republicans who didn't want him removed, who said this was wrong, right? There wasn't enough who said that, but there was some. And I think that's because they realized it was not the finest hour for the American presidency to, ask for help from a foreign government to investigate a potential rival. So the answer is just more law, right? More law that can be enforced through the ordinary courts, and more clear law that can be, the basis of, I think, a shared understanding the presidency has done something wrong. It's not satisfying because impeachment seems like it's a better answer, but impeachment's just not working, right? Given partisan affiliations. And in a sense, I think that each time someone impeaches, the party that's facing the impeachment feels like it's unfair in some way, right? Democrats thought it was deeply unfair to impeach Clinton for perjury and obstruction of justice. And Republicans were just like, this is the rule of law. And you just had a giant role reversal this time around, right? With the exact same arguments being made by the other party. Republicans talked about a coup and Democrats talked about the rule of law. And I think they were both somewhat sincere each time. So
there's a question in here about the lack of someone, Lisa Iorio is concerned about the lack of continuity of knowledge from one president to the next. For example, if Bill Clinton's anti-terrorism team, particularly Richard Clarke, had been a respected part of the Bush team, we might have prevented 9/11. If the Obama anti-pandemic team had been maintained, would the government have addressed COVID more effectively? I guess, either that specific question or more broadly, having read the book, I don't get a clear sense from you of your thoughts about the role of the standing bureaucracy, the deep state, the executive branch, as opposed to the president, is 4 million people, 1.5 million of which are in uniform. A lot of them are postal service delivery people. We have an enormous executive branch. Some of the motives that you ascribe to the presidency, we can discuss them in the benign or in the malevolent version, protective of their authority or seeking power. Cautious about the American economic interest or national security interest, or greedy and expansive in their concerns. I'm wondering if writing the book has given you a takeaway, not just about the president, but the presidency in all of its bureaucratic glory.
Sure. So this is a great question, Lisa, and Bill's amplification of it. My general sense is on the question of presidential power, the bureaucracy generally favors it, because the bureaucracy's power is parasitic on the president's. So if you're in the State Department and the president adopts sort of a broad understanding of his foreign affairs powers, many times it means that you have greater authority to exercise it because the president's not concerned about the particular question that you'll be concerned about. So there was this, during the Obama administration, there was an attempt to say, there was a statute passed by Congress saying you can't send a delegation to any UN commission headed up by Iran. And the president vetoed it, saying it was unconstitutional. But I don't really think that the president, really cares about who is being sent to this, particular commission. He's not sitting there deciding that. It's too much in the weeds. It's the State Department that gains bureaucratically from this. And that would be true for vetoes that shield the Defense Department from congressional regulation, right? It's the Defense Department that's probably going to exercise the discretion, not the president. So, on a general level, the bureaucracy favors an expansive presidency because its authority is parasitic on the presidency. As for the view that there's not bureaucratic continuity, I think there's something to this, right? That, every administration comes to office and they don't know what's going on. And that's why there's the transition team. And of course, the Miller Center is involved in that and hopefully is involved in that every 4 years. I think there's a sense amongst Republicans that there's also a deep state that was deeply hostile to the president. And that's going to create lasting damage for the concerns that were expressed by in the question, because if you are deeply if you're concerned that the bureaucracy will try to, quote, sabotage you or investigate you or hogtie you with an investigation, then you're not going to be willing to trust them, right? You're not going to be willing to trust, quote, Obama holdovers, and you're not going to be willing to trust the career bureaucracy because you're concerned that they're going to try to thwart your agenda. So I actually think that the cause of continuity and information sharing is harmed by the sense that the deep state was out to get Trump. And of course, you can deny that that's true, but you can't deny that some people have that fear. And, when, Chuck Schumer says, don't malign the intelligence community, they have ways of getting you. And then you think they got you, you're just playing into the hands of people who think that these people are out to get you. I don't know. I don't think that was a good thing. I mean, whatever you think about the investigation of the Trump campaign, one of the predictable effects of it is to be less trustful of holdovers from prior administrations.
So Duncan McCaskill, a friend and family member of the Miller Center, asks, have global information flows become so fast and time to make decisions so short that we need a powerful president? How can Congress compete and bring some level of parity with the executive? It is even possible. In the book, you do make an argument for bigger congressional staff, a stronger Library of Congress, a number of things that could put Congress on more equal par, including more lawyers in Congress. Help us unpack and understand that a little bit. And then I have a follow-up question after you talk about your own recommendations in this regard.
So the way to think about this, Bill and Duncan, is, it's been an arms race with one side, arming itself and the other side disarming itself. The executive bureaucracy, the lawyers, the advisors, et cetera, the information gatherers, the providers, the suppliers, has been growing exponentially. Whereas, during the Gingrich years, they decided to cut back Congress. And you can say that's like fiscally, sound or prudent. But it's not prudent on separation of powers basis, right? It's very hard for Congress to compete with the executive if Congress just doesn't have the expertise or the staff, and they don't have the expertise in the staff. Staffing levels were cut in 1995 in the Senate and the House, and they've never recovered, whereas the executive staff has ballooned since that time. And so, it's always been the case that the executive has an informational advantage. That's why we have a State of the Union clause. The State of the Union clause is not about some speech. That's a misnomer, right? There was no such thing as a State of the Union speech. That's something that we called it later on. The president made an annual address to Congress. It wasn't called the State of the Union speech. The president has an ongoing, continuing obligation to provide information relative to the State of the Union. It does not have to be a speech. It's just an information requirement. Give us information so that we can properly legislate. And so the Congress has always been at a disadvantage. It's at a greater disadvantage today because it's unilaterally disarmed. And so, I think it's obvious that Congress should have more staff, and it shouldn't be chagrined by this because it's funding a larger staff for the executive branch. It's unilateral disarmament, I say in the book.
So to take that one step further, having been part of negotiating teams, I'm curious to get your take, Sai, on whether it makes sense and would be valuable for Congress to be formally represented in foreign negotiations. In other words, one of the arguments, and I should have said this before, one of the arguments you make is the treaties are often no longer done as full formal treaties with 2/3 of the Senate voting. They're either done as trade agreements are, which is closer, I think, to original intent by having so-called fast-track legislation, straight up or down votes with no amendments, but both the House and Senate vote in majority as opposed to a 2/3 Senate vote. Mm-hmm. But then you also have presidential executive agreements, essentially, where the president simply negotiates an agreement with another country, and it's a straight-up executive action. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious as to whether it makes sense to actually have, rather than the president coming back and presenting to Congress an agreement or to the Senate an agreement that it votes 2/3 on, mm-hmm. whether the Senate should be formally included as part of those negotiating teams. Is that an unnatural, unintended blending of the two branches? Or is that how we should be conducting our foreign affairs?
Well, just a couple of things. This is a great question. I think the first thing you listeners need to understand is, although the Constitution talks about treaties and a 2/3 requirement, most things that are treaties are not subject to the 2/3 requirement, right? Because they just bypass this requirement by either having a statute of Congress passed or by the president doing unilaterally. So the treaty clause is just sort of it's an outdated part of the Constitution judged by modern practice. Very few things are submitted to the Senate, and the Senate ratifies, or rather consents to the ratification of very few things. And so it's of a piece with the declare war power, which has been read out of the Constitution, and of a piece with the president's, newfound legislative authority. As to what ought to be done going forward, in the past, members of Congress have been part of the negotiating teams. Actually, it's happened before where, presidents have appointed senators to help negotiate these things. And you can see why this makes sense, because the president wants to submit something to the Senate that will be consented to by the Senate. And the best way of doing that is to have someone from the Senate there who can sort of vet what's being discussed and say, well, this isn't going to fly. We're never going to approve this, so don't negotiate this. Now, the way Washington did this is he went to the Senate in person or in writing and said, I've got a bunch of questions for you. I'm going to negotiate a treaty. I want to know what I ought to do. And then they would answer the questions, and he would then get a sense of what he could or should not do, right? That is not happening as much these days. It's not happening at all, really, because I think the bureaucracy is the one conducting the investigation, the negotiations, not the president. And they don't want to, they think they have a better sense of what's in the interest of the United States than the Senate. But the end result is, I think, as you suggest, it becomes very hard to consent to a treaty in the Senate, right? 2/3 of the senators aren't going to agree to it. That's only part of the story, Bill. It's just hard for 2/3 of the Senate to agree to anything, right? So even if the Senate, even if the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the ranking minority member were involved in the negotiations, you might have Rand Paul or someone else who just doesn't like the treaty, or who just doesn't like the idea of international law constraining the US, opposed to it, having a filibuster, and then that's the reason why it doesn't get passed. So the US is much more averse to international agreements. The population, I think, of the US is, and the politicians are, than they were in the past, right? What was true, of the Treaty of Versailles, Wilson couldn't get through the Senate, is just on steroids today, right? There are senators who are just opposed to all these agreements, no matter what they say.
So my last question is my last question to you. We've got about 4 minutes left, and a number of great questions have come in, and we will keep and hold these and perhaps be able to respond to some of them afterwards. But we've just been through this very complex period in the country. The combination of, a year ago, we were all just hearing about the early days of what became impeachment. We then went from that through COVID, through the economic crisis, and now a deeply polarizing election. And given the storms of controversy in the last year, while you were finishing this book, finishing the edits on it, getting it sent out, has the last year changed your thinking about the presidency? It takes a long time to write a book and get it done. And yet, without commenting necessarily on this president and this presidency, this has been a crazy, complicated set of challenges that feel urgent and immediate. Does it reinforce for you that the president should be there in emergencies and executing the law, or that there is some innovation and new initiative that we should be looking to the president to lead us in?
Bill, this academics are loath to change their minds. The book is not about Trump, but I think people reading it will see that he is doing some of the very same things that his predecessors did. And it's sort of, I view the Trump administration as sort of par for the course. He is doing it in service of different ends. I view him as, he's more, rhetorically divisive than other presidents have been, and that's not a good thing, but it's not a legal question that I would be discussing in the book. So the book is really about how the presidency changes over time, why it changes over time, and why this is a problem. Because the ultimate conclusion is there's no limit to what the presidency can change into. If you just sort of if you step back and think about how the presidency has changed, you're sort of amazed that it's changed this much. And then you become, I think, aware of how much it could change further. Because as powerful as the presidency is, it's not all powerful yet, but it could be, right? If conceptions of the presidency change enough. And that's why the Banana Boy story comes into play, right? Because both sides are averting their eyes or looking the other way when they get what they want. And the end result is, everybody gets a banana, but the tree is bare. Or, I don't know what the metaphor is, but it's a bad outcome. So I think there are aspects of this presidency that are different, but I don't think that there are legal aspects. And to circle back to what your earlier question about the Justice Department always has a maximalist view of the presidency. And, you know, if you go back to, you know, Eric Holder, he said he was Barack Obama's wingman. And he asked the president to invoke executive privilege with respect to Fast and Furious. So, you know, people, you know, forget that departments of justice aren't really eager to investigate their presidents, right? They, you know, that's why we have special counsels and independent counsels, because they are eager to have a scalp on the wall.
Well, Sai, it's this has been a treat. Whether it's a banana or some other treat is for people in the audience to determine. But for me, it's been a great joy not just to spend the hour with you, but the hours with your book. Highly recommended to everybody, The Living Presidency, an originalist argument against its ever-expanding powers. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week when we'll be interviewing John Dickerson, a UVA grad, who has written a book that has actually some very similar conclusions to Sai on the hardest job in the world. So with that, we'll look to see you again next week, and thanks to everybody for joining.
Thanks to each and every one of you.